Welcome, everyone, to the OU SSG Trinity Term podcast series. We are delighted to have Dr. Filippa Lentzos joining us for today. Dr. Lentzos is a Senior Research Fellow at King's College London and expert in biological threats. Dr. Lentzos also works on biological disarmament with the SIPRI Armament Disarmament Programme and the Biological Weapons Convention. She will be speaking on biosecurity threats, a long view. So without further ado, Dr. Lentzos, please take it away.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to take you through a long view of biosecurity threats today. Biosecurity threats sit on a spectrum. And at one end are natural disease outbreaks and emerging infectious disease outbreaks, like the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic and the recent Ebola outbreak in Western Africa. At the other end, as you can see on the screen, are disease outbreaks that are deliberately caused, of which there have only been a few and of a very limited scale. Now, squeezed in between these two extremes is a series of linked and expanding threats stemming from our rapidly growing toolbox to modified genes and organisms. These advances are making it easier to produce increasingly dangerous pathogens. Although significant levels of technical skill and tacit knowledge are still required to produce dangerous pathogens, various developments, including the diffusion of knowledge to more diverse locations and actors than ever before, mean that barriers are being reduced. It is becoming easier to misuse the science for a larger group of people, and vulnerabilities are becoming greater. So what I'm trying to do today is to give you a sense of how perceptions of biological and health security threats, as well as the political responses to them, have evolved over the last century. Now, disease outbreaks like COVID-19 have not historically been considered a national security matter. Let's go back about 100 years. And this is an image of a typical microbiology lab in the late 1800s. This particular one is from the Lister Institute in London. It was in the late 1880s, and the late 1800s generally, that the discipline of microbiology was formed. And this is when the microbial basis of infectious disease was proven, when the pathogens causing common bacterial disease of importance were identified and studied, and it's also when their mechanisms of transmission were worked out. And with these discoveries, the potential arose to systematically design biological weapons. That is, combining dangerous bacteria or viruses with a delivery mechanism to inflict deliberate harm. Now, advances in science were applied to unconventional weapons at an industrial scale for the first time in World War I. And the image on your screen is one of the enduring images from that war. So soldiers in trenches covering up as best they can to protect themselves from gas clouds. These horrors of gas warfare in World War I were quickly followed by the 1918 flu outbreak that killed an estimated 50 million people towards the end of the war. Now, reeling from those staggering fatality numbers, the civilized world, in the language of the time, represented by the League of Nations, prohibited the use of both chemical and biological weapons under the 1925 Geneva Protocol. And this is the photograph of the League of Nations at its opening session in Geneva on the 15th of November in 1920. And here is the Geneva Protocol document itself. As you see, the use of asphyxiating, poisonous, or other gases, as well as bacteriological methods of warfare was, and I quote, justly condemned by the general opinion of the civilized world. On entering into force in February of 1928, the ban on chemical and biological weapons was to be universally accepted as part of international law, binding alike the conscience and the practice of nations, in the words of the time. Now, essentially, no first use agreement, the Geneva Protocol was not designed to stop the development of biological weapons. It was designed to stop their use. And significant programs to build biowarfare capacities soon ensued in several states. The earliest program was the Japanese program. This is an aerial overview of Unit 731 in Manchuria in China, the centerpiece of the program. Fairly large, the blueprint of Unit 731 lists at least 76 structures in the base compound itself. And all in all, the base perimeter incorporated more than 6 square kilometers. It's estimated that hundreds, if not thousands, of experiments were conducted on humans in the underground laboratories of Unit 731. Field tests were also carried out, where experiment prisoners were tied to posts in a circular arrangement around a biological bomb. 3,000 is the figure commonly quoted for the number of persons exterminated in Unit 731 during its years of operation, though some argue that this estimate is extremely low. It wasn't just Japan who conducted research on biological weapons. Most major World War II combatants had programs, but none of these were on the scale of the Japanese program, and none are known to have involved human subjects experiments. So what sets the Japanese program apart from the others is how early it started, its scale, and the experiments on people. The post-war American effort to show that biological warfare could rival nuclear warfare was extensive, and it involved lab and human subjects research into potential pathogens. It involved industrial production and stockpiling of agents, the manufacture of bombs and spray generators, the indoctrination of troops, as well as large-scale field trials. Research and development was primarily located at Fort Detrick in Maryland, and the image is of the main entrance as it looked in the 1950s. And here are some scientists at Detrick doing glove box work in the late 1960s. This is an aerobiology chamber at Detrick used to test biological weapons developed in the lab. And the next step up from that aerobiology chamber was the gigantic 1 million liter test sphere known as the 8-ball. And this is what you can see in front of you is a model of the 8-ball. But to give you a sense of the entire chamber, or to give you a sense of what this actually looked like in real life, look at what the equator looks like on this. And then here you see what the 8-ball looked like in real life with people at the equator level to give you that sense of scale, really. Here's another angle of the 8-ball from the bottom. A large number of animals were exposed to microbial aerosols in the 8-ball over the years. More than 2,000 rhesus monkeys alone were used on the anthrax trials. So what the 8-ball did was to test biological bombs in a highly artificial and controlled environment. But performance in the field might be an entirely different thing. And so to test the viability and effects of the biological weapons developed in the lab, American bioweaponeers carried out large open-air field tests. Pathogens, toxins, and their simulants were used to better estimate aerosol dispersion patterns, as well as agent survivability and virulence in different settings under various weather conditions. And some of these trials, a large number of these trials, in fact, were carried out at the Dugway Proving Ground in Utah, where the US Army has around 800,000 acres of the Great Salt Lake Desert to test biological and chemical defense systems in a secure and isolated environment. So this is a historical image of the Dugway Proving Ground gate. And this is a 1961 aerial photo showing the flow of toxic gas in the test grid at the Dugway Proving Ground. Now, field testing at that time was not just restricted to the secure and isolated part of the Utah desert. It also included city simulant tests, large area land tests, as well as sea trials. The sea trial of Project 112, for instance, involved at least 13 warships, including USS Power, shown here, along with bombers and airplanes fitted with spray generators. And there were also some human trials in the American bioweapon program on a voluntary basis. Nearly 200 human subject experiments were conducted in what was called Project Whitecoat. And I believe this picture is from testing in the 8-ball itself. Now, yet despite intensive development and testing, which eventually did demonstrate that biological weapons could form as great a threat to large populations as nuclear weapons, biological weapons weren't assimilated into military thinking and planning. And there's been no known state use since 1945. In a political move that caught American bioweaponeers off guard, the newly elected President Nixon unilaterally renounced biological weapons in 1969, paving the way for the BWC. The BWC, the Biological Weapons Convention, is the multilateral treaty that comprehensively prohibits biological weapons, which was negotiated and agreed at the United Nations in the early 1970s. And this is an image from the Council chamber at the Palais des Nations in Geneva, where the treaty was negotiated. Now, the Council chamber was originally built to accommodate members of the League of Nations, and today, or rather in non-COVID times, it hosts the meetings of the Conference on Disarmament, as it did when this photo was taken in 1971, just before the BWC was agreed. And this is the BWC, the convention itself, which, as you can see, prohibits the development, production, and stockpiling of biological weapons. And together with the 1925 Geneva Protocol, these two treaties form the biological cornerstones of the rules of war, totally prohibiting the use of biological weapons. Now, ironically, it was after signing the Biological Weapons Convention that the Soviet program began its incredible expansion. The politicization of science under Stalin and his support for Trofim Lysenko, who believed the environment could change hereditary traits, had severely set back Soviet biology. By the late 1960s, early 1970s, ambitious Soviet scientists in the fields of biology and biochemistry calculated that unless they persuaded political leaders that modern biotechnology held substantial military potential, the level of support that they would receive to gain capacities on par with Western societies would probably remain low. They were hugely successful. By the end of the 1980s, the Soviet Union possessed the largest and most sophisticated biological weapons program the world has ever seen. Estimates of the number of people employed by the program at its height are generally put between 30,000 and 60,000 people. One of the key research centers highlighted there is Vector, which was built as a large isolated research campus in Kosovo outside of Novosibirsk. The size of the high containment facilities blows your mind. Nearly 1,500 square meters of biosafety level 4 labs. That's the highest containment level labs that we have. Here is another image from Vector. And just as an aside, you might have heard about the recent Vector explosion in the fall. So just to flag my write-up of that in the bulletin, should you wish to learn more. The Soviet program also built factories for biological agent production, most impressively a large plant at Stepnogorsk in Kazakhstan, a little to the west of Vector, that reportedly could produce very quickly large amounts of agents, particularly anthrax, if mobilized. And here is an image of the Stepnogorsk production facility in which, to give you a sense of the scale of the program, the building you see housed aerosol explosive chambers, and directly behind it is an anthrax drying facility, which you don't really see. The bunkers in the foreground were for filling and assembling biological munitions. And if you imagine that you're the photographer inside the building from where you're taking this photograph, is this rows of 20,000 liter fermenters. And again, and what you see here is just the top floor. They extend quite significantly below into lower levels. And again, the scale just absolutely blows your mind. 20,000, each of these is 20,000 liters. When the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 1990s, much of the bioweapons program collapsed as well. The three key military institutes involved in the biological weapons program remain closed to outsiders, and it's not possible to ascertain whether the program has been terminated in its entirety. The Russian official position is that no offensive program ever existed in the Soviet Union. Now, bioterrorism first emerged as a political concept during the early 1990s in the United States. As the Cold War faded, the threat of terrorists armed with biological weapons and other weapons of mass destruction began to replace the Soviet threat. And different assessments of the importance, urgency, and scale of the threat were present in the early political debates on bioterrorism. On the one hand, you had alarmists. These included prominent scientific and technical advisors, and they tended to emphasize the possibility of apocalyptic attacks with natural pathogens and genetically engineered hybrids, and the vulnerability of the civilian population to this. They were less focused on the identities of bioterrorists and in their interests in pursuing such attacks or in their capacities to do so. On the other hand, you had skeptics, and skeptics tended to have a background in and training in the history, politics, and culture of terrorism. And for them, questions of identity, interests, and details of past attackers were the primary questions to ask. Although little credible evidence existed at the time that such states or terrorists would or even could resort to biological weapons, alarmism ultimately overcame skepticism, and federal funds poured into new US preparedness and civilian biodefense programs of considerable institutional proportions. The image that you're seeing on the screen is from the Shinrikyo chemical attack on the Tokyo subway in the mid-1990s. Shinrikyo, of course, famously also pursued biological weapons, but failed in their attempt to develop them. This is one of the Amerithrax letters. Amerithrax is what the FBI codenamed the series of anonymous letters containing anthrax that were sent to media outlets and the US Senate within weeks of the 9/11 terrorist attacks on New York and Washington on September 11th, 2001. Now, Amerithrax revealed serious shortcomings in US biosecurity, and they also raised fears about the growing potential for bioterrorism on American soil. So the threat of bioterrorism became one of the Bush administration's key security concerns during its 2 terms in office, and initiated a series of new regulations, policies, and programs to further strengthen US preparedness and defense against a bioweapon attack. And here's Bush signing Project BioShield, for instance. Concern about the threat of international terrorism coupled with weapons of mass destruction proliferation was also exported from the United States to international security forums. The international community's premier security forum, the UN Security Council, decided, for example, in Resolution 1540, that all states should refrain from providing any form of support to non-state actors that attempt to obtain biological and other weapons of mass destruction for terrorist purposes. New laws and other non-proliferation measures were implemented in capitals around the world, and counter-offensives materialized in international risk and security strategies. The World Health Organization, which we've heard so much about in recent weeks and months, has traditionally been reluctant to address security-related issues for fear that its public health mission would be compromised. But the WHO has increasingly been gaining a profile as a key actor in the security world, and it has exerted significant influence in how perceptions of biological threats have evolved. From the outset, its overriding message has been that whatever the cause of epidemics or emerging infectious diseases, the response to them will initially be the same. So they say, in most situations, the public health system will be the first to detect cases and raise the alarm. In other words, the threat of deliberate use of biological weapons should be thought of as part of a wider spectrum of threats that also includes the threat of disease from natural outbreaks and accidental releases. And the most effective response to these threats is to bolster public health measures. Following this lead, the Obama administration ushered in an evolution in US thinking about its response to bioterrorism. The administration's first major policy initiative on biosecurity was the National Strategy for Countering Biological Threats. While the Bush administration's efforts had been focused on biodefense, this strategy was focused on prevention. It emphasized linking deliberate disease outbreaks from bioterrorism attacks with naturally occurring disease outbreaks to create a more seamless and integrated link across all types of biological threats, echoing what the WHO had been pushing multilaterally for years. In his 2011 speech to the UN General Assembly, President Obama called upon all countries to, and I quote, come together to prevent and detect and fight every kind of biological danger, whether it's a pandemic like H1N1, or a terrorist threat, or a treatable disease. In February 2014, the US spearheaded the Global Health Security Agenda to establish global capacity to prevent, detect, and rapidly respond to biological threats. And a test case was brewing, even as the initiative was getting off the ground. By August 2014, the WHO declared the Ebola epidemic in Western Africa a public health emergency of international concern. This was the first time one of the first times that the WHO was presenting to the UN Security Council, and Margaret Chan said at the time, "This is likely the greatest peacetime challenge that the United Nations and its agencies have ever faced. None of us experienced in containing outbreaks has ever seen in our lifetimes an emergency on this scale, with this degree of suffering and with this magnitude of cascading consequences." And as we know from that, from the Ebola outbreak, there was a close cooperation between national security communities, militaries, public health officials, and WHO. At the beginning of my presentation, I talked about the spectrum of biosecurity threats. I've so far talked about deliberate disease outbreaks by both states and non-state actors, and I've talked briefly about how recently natural outbreaks have also been viewed as a security concern. Squeezed in between these two types of threats that sit at either end of the spectrum is a series of linked threats, all based on significant scientific advances in capacities to modify genes and organisms. And these include unintended consequences of research, lab accidents, lack of awareness, and negligence. A set of high-profile scientific experiments first drew attention to these threats in the early 2000s. These experiments made mousepox more deadly. They chemically synthesized a virus from scratch in a lab and reconstructed the extinct 1918 flu virus. The discussion around what came to be called dual-use research of concern reignited a decade later with another set of high-profile experiments. These gain-of-function experiments, as they're called, resulted in the creation of H5N1 bird flu viruses that had been modified in the lab to spread from birds to mammals. If accidentally or deliberately released, these viruses could have resulted in a deadly pandemic. They were potentially pandemic pathogens. The gain-of-function research prompted a moratorium, followed by the release of US government policies for dual-use research of concern oversight. The sorts of experiments that are of concern include the ones listed on the slide. Very few, if any, other countries have to date developed this sort of guidance. I'm getting to my last section now. So over the last couple of decades, the focus of political responses to biosecurity threats has been on non-state actors. There have been efforts to raise awareness in the scientific community about biological threats, to tighten up safety and security practices, to develop codes of conduct to counter inadvertent misuse of the science, and to foster responsible science. There have also been efforts to counter deliberate misuse from biohackers, from lone wolf scientists, criminals, extremists, and terrorists. Yet there is no public reporting that any non-state actors have the capability to inflict mass casualties using biological agents, and there is little evidence of past interest from non-state actors to develop mass casualty biological capabilities either. Terrorists tend to be conservative and use weapons that are readily available and have a proven track record, not unconventional weapons that are more difficult to develop and deploy. History has shown, however, as I've been telling you in this talk, that states have had both capacities and intent to develop biological weapons. Politically, the focus has to shift to seriously consider what professional scientists working in interdisciplinary teams in labs with sustained funding are able to do if they apply scientific advances to deliberately develop sophisticated biological weapons. Today, no country openly possesses biological weapons or claims that these kinds of weapons are required for their national security. And there is no verified public reporting that any country is maintaining a bioweapons program. Yet in practical terms, biological weapons are not really weapons in the way you think of a gun or a bomb. Biological weapons are processes rather than items. You should not, therefore, think of a country as possessing biological weapons. It's more accurate to think of a country being in a position to threaten or perpetrate a biological attack. In the biological field, it makes little sense to contemplate simply the possession or non-possession of weapons. It is the degree of a state's proximity to being in a position to threaten or perpetrate a biological attack in terms of capability and intent that is the critical issue. And there are worrying signs of buildups in infrastructure capacity. And this is my last slide now. If the intent was there, scientific advances could enable disease-causing organisms to be modified to increase their virulence, expand their host range, increase their transmissibility, or enhance their resistance to therapeutic interventions. Low-risk pathogens could potentially be modified to become high-risk pathogens. Now, in addition to modifying existing pathogens, these existing pathogens being represented on the slide by the biohazard sign at the bottom left-hand corner, scientific advances are also making it possible to synthetically create known pathogens, represented by the double helix there on the left. Scientific advances are even making it possible to synthetically recreate extinct pathogens like the variola virus, which caused smallpox. Entirely new pathogens that have never existed in nature could also potentially be created. These are sometimes referred to as chimeras or superpathogens, where characteristics of two or more pathogens are combined. New delivery mechanisms, the middle column here, are also opening up through scientific advances. Bombs, missiles, cluster bombs, sprayers, and injection devices have traditionally been used for biological weapons. It would now be possible to add others: drones, nanorobots, even insects. Scientific advances could even alter our entire conception of how biological weapons work. The use of computing power to mine genomic data sets for genetic markers and gene functions, as well as pharmacogenomics, drug development, and personalized medicine, could be turned on its head for ultra-targeted biological warfare. Using the knowledge gained through AI from genomics and health data, biological weapons could be engineered that harm only a specific individual or group of individuals based on their genes, prior exposure to vaccines, or known vulnerabilities in their immune systems. And rather than just making us sick, future biological weapons could even directly target our immune system, nervous system, genome, or microbiome. Beyond humans, new biological weapons could modulate the environment, our crops, or degrade materials. The million-dollar question is there such intent? And while there is some political posturing suggesting that there might be, there is still a narrow window of opportunity in which to bolster the norm against biological weapons. There is nothing inevitable about a technological trajectory. There is room to shape it. Key to this is structurally evolving biological arms control. And with that, I thank you for your attention and welcome your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lentzos. If I may, I'll kick us off. So you were talking a bit about the dual use research aspect, and I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit more in the context of academia. So another prominent example was in 2017. There was a group at the University of Alberta in Canada who said that they were able to synthesize the horsepox virus, which is an extinct virus related to smallpox, from genetic pieces that they ordered in the mail to investigate therapeutic properties. Do you think that academic research along these lines should be constrained or restricted, or do you think that academics with key skills and knowledge should be participating in biological weapons research?
Well, there should not be any biological weapons research at the moment, of course. That is prohibited by the convention, but there is a lot of dual-use research, as you point out, and the horsepox example is very pertinent, I think. Horsepox is a close cousin to smallpox, and smallpox is one of the only diseases that we've really eradicated from the face of the planet. We are keeping stocks in only 2 places in the world, one in the United States at the CDC in Atlanta, Georgia, and the other at Vector in Russia. And there has been a debate for a number of years whether we should just get rid of those stocks entirely, because why do we keep the virus when we've had this massive public health campaign to get rid of this disease? And essentially what that experiment showed was that even if you get rid of the stocks that we have of the virus, we can now just create smallpox synthetically in the lab. So it was in a way an experiment that was a sort of a proof of concept. It was a dual use. It's dual use research in that knowledge can now be used for nefarious purposes. What do I think about that kind of research? Well, it wasn't purely academic research. It was very much done in collaboration with a pharmaceutical company or a biotechnology company. And that's an important distinction, because in the States, federally funded research, academic research, is bound by certain regulations. Privately funded research isn't. So unlike in the United Kingdom, where all research, regardless of funding source, is covered by our regulations. So that was important. I think that that experiment got too little attention. Certainly, I believe that there are types of experiments that should not be done, that are simply too dangerous. There are the scientists involved would have said, yes, we carried out a risk-benefit analysis and we showed that the benefits are greater than the risks. But with these kinds of research, and we're seeing this also in terms of the discussion around the research on coronaviruses, the risks are uncertain, the benefits are uncertain. So how can we then even carry out a proper and adequate risk assessment? So from my perspective, I think we need to engage more stakeholders in these kinds of assessments. And I thought that was an experiment that shouldn't have gone ahead.
Thank you for the fantastic talk. I'm curious what you think of sort of international regulation in this process, in terms of, like, for the nuclear process for weapons, we have the International Atomic Energy Agency to monitor, because there's a series of clear steps in terms of, like, the amount of enriched uranium, for instance. Is it possible to have an equivalence in this bioweapon space, or is the barrier to entry too low? Is it too distributed to even really have an apt comparison to the nuclear space?
You mean in terms of verifying compliance with the treaties?
Yes.
Because, of course, in the nuclear space, there is a treaty. In the chemical weapons space, there is a treaty that is being verified by an international international inspectors, essentially. In the biological space, there is a biological weapons convention, but we don't have an inspectorate. We don't have an organization that ensures national implementation with that. And there is a good reason for that. And it's because it is incredibly difficult to verify compliance, because so much in the biospace, so much of the equipment, so much of the material, so much of the knowledge is dual use. So it's hard to figure out, it's hard to narrow down the sorts of facilities and the sorts of experiments, the sorts of projects that you would have to monitor. And so there have been efforts to establish a sort of verification protocol along the lines, not so much on the nuclear side, but much more along the lines of what's going on in the chemical side, that the OPCW carries out, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. But they've so far failed. There have been now, more recently, other approaches to assess compliance with the treaty that are taking a different approach than on the nuclear side and on the chemical side. I think this is the right way. What they're doing on the nuclear chemical side is very much based on metrics. It's quantitative. The sorts of assessment, compliance assessment efforts that are now being made on the biological side are much more qualitative, much more not about the numbers and the sizes of the fermenters and the capacities of the fermenters, but more about, well, what is actually being done, what protocols are in place, talking to the people involved, etc. So there's a long way to go still in terms of compliance assessment on the biological side, and that is one of the areas within arms control that needs to be strengthened for sure. Thanks for the question.
Thank you so much for your really interesting talk. Regarding the Biological Weapons Convention, almost all states are signatories, but I was wondering, are there any issues which states clash upon? And also for the states that haven't signed on, what are their main reasons for not doing so?
Well, as you say, most countries in the world have signed on, and that is good. The main sticking point, the key state that hasn't signed on, is Israel. And so there are other countries in the area like Egypt who have not ratified. They've signed, but they've not ratified because of Israel. And so the Middle East is I think the main issues around the Middle East are the main sticking point to all nations in the world signing up. Of course, this has been a long process. The treaty was open for signatures in the early 70s. So there's been a good 45, 50 years nearly of states being encouraged to sign up to the treaty. Some didn't sign up originally purely for bureaucratic reasons, some purely because this has been a low priority, et cetera, et cetera. But as you say, we're nearly there, and then the main sticking point is really the Middle East. Now, are there difficulties? Yes, there are many things that there's disagreement on with the treaty. One of the premier things is exactly what Matthew asked me about, which is the verification and compliance assessment. How do you make sure treaties are actually countries are actually implementing the treaty once they've signed up? So that, I think, is the main sticking point. There are a number of other areas in which the treaty also needs to be strengthened, for sure, but that's the main one.
Hi, thanks for the talk. My question was whether there should be different policy responses to biosecurity events that correspond to the spectrum that you identified, and if so, how states can accurately identify where an event fits on that spectrum.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. And it's something that I've been arguing for a while, because that is not the approach that's been taken in the policy community. I think we need to identify the sort of threat we're worried about and the sort of actor we're worried about, and then think about what the best sort of measure, policy measure would be to impact that. It doesn't make sense to implement codes of conduct if what we're most worried about are terrorists. It doesn't make sense to focus FBI outreach to the scientific community if what we're worried about are state programs. So yes, absolutely, we need to target our responses, our policy responses, to the sorts of threats and the sorts of actors that we're worried about. And I think we're not seeing this, but we need to have a much more nuanced debate about the sorts of risks that we're worried about, and where on the spectrum they are. And as I was saying in my talk, we've heard an awful lot about bioterrorism. We've also heard a lot about biohackers, and the DIY community, for instance. We very, very seldom hear about the potential of state-supported groups or even state programs. And I'm not saying, bioterrorism isn't a concern. I'm not saying non-state actors, other kinds of non-state actors aren't a concern. But we need to have a more of an equilibrium in the sorts of actors that we focus on, and state actors need to be on our radar. Thanks.
Okay, I think I'll ask the final question. I wanted to ask you about the threat of bioterrorism today and how easily it can reach the hands of terrorists in this new post-COVID world. So there have been reports of dark web forums where individuals have put out calls with people with COVID symptoms to spread it as much as they can. So how do states go about combating this? And how do you propose it might change the way that states view bioterrorism and approach it? Or does it stand to cause a lot of problems, especially if COVID is at one point, if we manage to contain it, what would the risk be like for that containment being very short term if it's so easily able to fall into the hands of bioterrorists?
The terrorism aspect has been discussed for a fair number of years now. As I was explaining, it's really following the end of the Cold War that this bioterrorism rise came in, or the focus on bioterrorism really came in. And there was a large amount in the beginning of the 2000s, a large amount of attention paid to bioterrorism. That waned a little bit in the tens. And I suspect, or we've started seeing some concerns around terrorism now following the corona outbreak. It's a hard one. It deserves attention, for sure. But if what we're really concerned about are mass fatalities, if we're really concerned about high-tech and sophisticated biological weapons, the focus shouldn't be on terrorists. So what terrorists can do is they can fairly easily, not easy, but fairly easily get a hold of a pathogen or a virus or a bacteria. That in itself is not a biological weapon, right? You need to combine it with some sort of delivery mechanism. Now, that could be as simple as your own body, right? You could go and sit on the tube and infect people. But that doesn't make a very sophisticated biological weapon. You were talking about fatalities in tens, not in the thousands, and the psychological impact of it is where I think the main impact would be. So there you would have an enormous amount of concerned citizens, essentially. So what can we do to combat it? Well, I think communication is essential, because that is one way to combat the psychological terror that a bioterrorism incident could bring. Yeah, I think that would be my main point.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lentzos, for joining us today and for giving us such a fantastic insight into bioweapons and their complex history. I think that's probably all we have time for. So
well, thank you to all of you for listening and for your very insightful questions. I'm impressed that there were no real COVID-related questions, and because there has been obviously a lot of interest around that too. And I think you're wise to focus your seminar series on non-COVID related things, because we are all getting a little too much of the COVID in our daily lives. So keep safe, everyone. Keep well, and good luck.